Hello and welcome back to Topdeckers. I'm Bubbles and I'm joined by Berto, and today we're going to be revealing some very special, very exciting cards for the upcoming Brothers in Arms expansion. Now, these cards I think are really, really fun. These are kind of cards that I play. They've been hand selected for me because I like to build decks around these mechanics already, even though they're not fully supported. And I'm just excited to see them getting more support in this expansion. Are you ready to get into this, Berto?
Boy, howdy am I.
Howdy, yeah. I like the positive attitude. So the first card, we're gonna get a little drum roll, is the 91st Astrocan. Now this is a Soviet infantry, so a little bit of Soviets here. Costs 2 credits, but what I really, really enjoy about this is this effect. I mean, it's got very nice stats, 3/3 for 2. That's already a very well statted infantry. Whenever this unit gets a pincer effect, it gets +1/+2. Which I think is crazy, especially because you drop this on turn 2, then you buff it with the Jaeger pincer. Next turn, you reduce the op cost, you move it to the front line, then you've got a 4/5 in the front line. Next turn, you buff it with the Stug. It's just going to get really, really ridiculous. You've got this, 5/7 in the front line of heavy armor, like ridiculously early. I'm personally hyped for this card. I'm going to be building around it. But that doesn't mean I'm going to be doing well with it. And that's sort of my first question for you, Beto, is like, how competitively viable do you think this is? Because obviously, stats alone generally aren't competitive. Do you think there's any space for this, or you're not convinced that the raw stat-mageddon is going to be enough to make a dent?
Well, what I am convinced by is that playing this unit and then playing Stug 3G Shurizen is a good play. What I'm not convinced about is that you're able to hit that on turn 2 into turn 3 often enough for it to be a competitively viable deck.
Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense. It is a standard, so you can have 4 of it, but even then, that's 4 in a 39 card deck, so you're not going to get it every single game, even if you mulligan around it. And then if you do mulligan around it, obviously you're not getting this Stug quite as often. So that makes perfect sense. Now I do want to get into the next card reveal before we dive any more into analyzing these, because these do sort of play off each other quite well. The next card we're going to be revealing is a German card, and second drum roll going. It is the MEBF 109G. Now it's a 3/3 fighter for free with a 2 op cost, so quite a heavy op cost, but it is a pincer unit, and it has pincer. When this unit attacks and destroys a unit, gain a credit card and draw a card. So you pincer this on another unit, and now both this MEBF and that unit have this ability. Which is kind of like the Marder and the Nashub sort of rolled into one fighter. I'm excited to play this and sort of match up against Bridair, drop this, and just start eating swordfishes. Obviously, you do have to attack. They can trade into it, and you don't get anything from it. So, that's something the Marder has over this. But do you think this will help at all with the consistency of the 91st Astrakhan, since it is another 3k sort of pincer unit like the Stug? Or do you think the Astrocan isn't the target you're going to want to be casting on this, and instead you're going to be want to casting either things like artillery or things which, can sort of attack without receiving damage back?
Well, my first thought when I see the card is actually imagine this with like a Naxshub, and you probably don't want to pincer it onto the Naxshub in most scenarios, but the fact that this can start to net you credits, especially in combination with a Naxshub, I feel like will make some pretty funny games. It's hard to evaluate the difference between this and something like the Stug 3G. It does, I think, if you're playing this deck, you're playing both of these for sure, because they are premium 3-drops with high value pincer effects. The MEBF is a little more vulnerable because it doesn't have the heavy armor. It only has 3 defense. Somebody might be able to get rid of the pincer before you get any value out of it, but the payoff is quite a bit higher. If you can get this pincer effect to trigger once, I think you're happy you've put this card in your deck.
And then, obviously anything beyond that is just profit, and if you've got this down and a Marder and a Nashub, sort of dream scenario, every kill, for that first kill, at least you're getting 3 credits and 2 cards. It's a little bit ridiculous. Now,
Yeah.
you mentioned putting these in the same deck. We have had already revealed a couple of the pincer units, and we've had the Tupolev SB2. This is a 5/5 Soviet bomber for 6 credits with 2 operation cost, and it has pincer. It costs the enemy plus 2 credits to target or attack this unit. Now, this is quite a heavy card, costing 6 credits, and it does have a nice defensive and evasive ability. However, your opponent gets to choose which one is easier to kill to remove that ability. Do you think this Tupolev, being such a heavy unit, will find a way into this pincer deck, or do you think this pincer deck is going to be a purely sort of aggressive tempo deck, and this Tupolev is just going to be too slow to find a home in it?
Well, I think the key to making the pincer deck work is having enough early units that you are happy to pincer with. So I don't think that the Tupolev quite fits into that strategy. I think it does add a fair bit of inconsistency to the deck, but this deck is pretty new. We don't have a ton of pincer options to choose from, so due to our lack of options, we might be forced to go a little bit away from the aggressive direction and move a little more into the higher end with the Tupolev. So I could certainly see it being in the deck, and I can see it putting in some extreme work in certain situations. But the fact that you're playing a bomber that does nothing immediately, and you need to already have another unit on the board, hopefully one with a decent amount of defense, it seems like a little bit of a dream scenario that the Tupolev it needs to find itself in.
I mean, I'm curious to see how consistent this sort of credit gain is going to be. You've got these MEBFs, you've got this Nashube. You could even put stuff like Iron from the North in the deck. I am curious if you could sort of trade out your turn and then have enough credits towards the end of your turn to deploy this on turn 4 or turn 5, just to get it down a little bit earlier, just to try and sort of, narrow out that curve a little bit. It's also worth noting for the viewers, at the time of recording, we've not seen all the cards in the expansion, so it's possible just a couple days after this video or something, they'll release a new crazy pincer unit, and then suddenly there'll be options which weren't even available to us. But I think just look at the options available to us, it's clear that pincer is a mechanic which is being pushed, and it wouldn't surprise me if we see more pincer options, if not in this expansion, maybe in skirmishes or maybe an upcoming expansion. I do want to just quickly talk about, before I move on, Germany main or US main? Germany main or Soviet main? I prefer Germany main. I like the package. I feel like there's more than 12 German cards I want. I want the Panzer 35Ts. I want all of these, like the Enigma's quite high value. The Iron from the North can be quite good for these very quick plays. And I really like cards like Nashube and the Jag Bomber. Is there much of a reason to do Soviet main instead? Is there something I'm missing out on there? Maybe it's a little bit more defensive. You can get like engineers and play a slower game. You do have these really expensive pincer units. I believe you have like a 9k unit or something with pincer. Is there much logic to going Soviets with what we've seen already? Or do you think Germany main is going to be the way forward at the moment?
Well, I think Soviet does offer a lot of useful tools. You do have the only elite pincer unit in the game, the T-28 in Soviet, although that's more of a value generation card over a very long time scale, which I don't think is what this deck is going to be looking for, which is more of a mid-range deck. It looks like the pincer deck is sort of forming here. However, the cards could still be good enough. And then when you look at the other like staple tools, like sickles, the engineers, I think those are good, but I feel like you're right that they don't offer as not like the engineers doesn't offer as much as Nashube in this deck. And you could even still maybe find the room to play sickles, bloody sickles.
I mean, it
in
helps that you've got
the
dive
German
bombing,
name.
right? You've got dive bombing, which is
Yeah,
quite similar to sickle. It's sort of a 1k ping with some extra added value on the side.
but you lose the card draw, which I'm such
Yeah,
a fan of.
like the card draw is certainly nice, and it really seems like efficient cycling and card draw is going to be one of these mechanics which this deck tries to take advantage of, because I do think you're going to want Marder in the deck, and obviously this MEBF as well. I think it's going to be one of the things, you're deploying units, you're pincering units, you're trading your units, and you're just cycling this at such an efficient rate that your opponent is going to run out of resources way before you do, especially with some key sort of AoE tools like Desperate Measures and stuff being put into the rotation list to taken out. I think it's just going to help these unit-based decks a bit. Which actually brings me to the next sort of topic with these pincer units I wanted to bring up, which is it looks a little bit like with this expansion and the cards we're seeing and the cards in the rotation list, 1939 is trying to sort of slow down the game a little bit and make it a little bit more unit-based. We've seen things like research getting rotated, and we've seen things like sort of repair being pushed, and this new veteran mechanic, strong emphasis on units staying alive and surviving for a long period and getting payoff from that, which I think might help Pincer, right? Because Pincer is all about if one of these units dies, you lose the buff on both units. Do you think if there's a stronger emphasis on unit survival and keeping these units alive for a long time, pincer cards, even older and existing pincer cards which haven't seen as much play, and newer ones will be more viable and more prevalent because of this sort of new emphasis on unit survival? Or do you think it's just a little bit too fragile and it's still just going to have this large downside that your opponent can often 2 for 1 you, right? They use one removal tool and they get rid of 2 abilities.
Well, that's a difficult question. I think a lot of it comes down to how much unit combat is going on and how much order-based removal is going on. Because if you're playing this Astrocan on turn 2 and you're getting a pincer effect on turn 3, if your opponent is trying to deal that out with units, they're probably going to have a pretty bad time just trading in, especially if this Astrocan has heavy armor or something similar, or if it has ambush from the 128 rifles. That's all really powerful, and that I think is more effective in a slightly slower game. Although, even with cards pushing for things to maybe be a little slower, we're still going to have Jagro in the game, even without Feigned Retreat. And I think that it's going to be a challenge to get the Astrakhan to the front line against an aggro deck. And I think it's going to be hard to keep it from getting removed by an order against a control deck.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Aggressive decks, your big statted units in the back line, they're not so effective. They're just trading, once per turn, but they're costing you some credits to do so. And while it does have 3 HP, that's generally the threshold that most playable removal sits at the moment, right? You've got Air Superiority, you've got Red Dawns, these sorts of things. You've got, obviously, bigger removal pieces like Hammer, but even just stuff like Defend in Depth. Generally, 3 HP isn't quite enough to survive most targeted removal. That's one of the things 5th Rangers do really, really nicely, is that 4 HP just makes them so difficult to deal with. So I definitely see that sort of problem where it's not quick enough to fight aggro, but it's not tanky enough to survive this first turn in control. Maybe we'll get something crazy like a 0k pincer unit at some point, and that will just enable the Astrakhan. But until that point, I do see your sort of concerns where it might just be, even at 2k, just a little bit too slow to get it active. Because it's not disrupting your opponent's game plan. It's very powerful, this big amount of stats, but it's just not aggressive at all.
Yeah, and I do want to mention the Tupolev SB2 again. Is pretty effective against control decks, I would think. In a target that they're forced to remove, and that is going to create a lot of issues with their ability to remove it. And crucially being 6 cost to dodge Annihilation, which I suspect will remain a very important order and removal tool during the coming expansion.
No, yeah, I mean, having 6k credit cost is very nice against the Annihilation. And then obviously 5 HP, that's, able to dodge a lot of removal. That's a very, very large amount of hit points. But then even if you have a unit you're scared is going to get, say, Annihilation or removed, you could just pincer it and just keep it alive for a couple turns, right? You've got something which, like a Skytrain, say, just for some reason you're doing a crazy USA Soviet deck, you're worried your Skytrain's going to get killed, or you can just delay that Annihilation by a couple turns, right, by putting the pincer on it. Overall, I'm really, really excited for these cards. I've been playing pincer decks already, and they're not even properly supported at the moment, so I'm going to be having so much fun in these. But I don't know if pincer is going to be the thing you're playing when the expansion drops, but I'm sure there's going to be plenty of other options. We've seen some cool Japanese units like the Recon, which has sort of destruction deal 1 to everything. So I think there's going to be maybe a slot for a sort of new control deck, maybe Japan, Poland in that. I'm curious, is there anything you're looking forward to already in the expansion, or are you still waiting for this inspiration?
I'd say I'm waiting for inspiration. I'm trying to look at all the cards at face value and not exclusively in the archetypes they fill. For example, can you run MEBF 109G in a deck that's not a dedicated pincer deck? Maybe just with 35 Ts? It could be strong enough in maybe a kind of Jagro to replace some of that draw you're losing. I think there's so many options coming with this expansion, and with the change to the rotation system. I'm very excited, and I'm very lost. I think we're all going to be on the first few days while the meta starts to settle.
I enjoy that, though, when you see a nation pop up on the enemy HQ and you think, I don't know what that is. And then they start playing it and you just get more and more confused. And then you've lost the game and you're like, I need to rebuild that deck. I'm making that deck right now.
Yeah, and I've had quite a while since I've felt that feeling in cards, and I'm ready for it to renew.
Ready for the US to actually still be USA frontline. And you're like, screw this, I'm going back to casting. I'm not playing.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you everyone for watching. Thank you if you stuck around to listen to us chatter about the cards and how we feel about them. No worries if you're one of the people that just came in and looked at the cards and left. I suppose I could insult you if I wanted. You'd be none the wiser because you wouldn't still be watching. But that's not what we're about on Topdeckers. Thank you everyone for watching, and make sure to keep your eyes out for all the other reveals.